Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, Sona and I will be breaking down this Netflix series called The Perfect Couple. Is that correct?
Correct.
And it's been a little while since we've recorded. Sona, have you seen anything along the way that has thrilled you?
Oh gosh, I didn't think about that before we got on this podcast. No, I've just been doing my usual reality TV in the background situation. So no, there's nothing super compelling. Although I will say I have just started, I think it's called The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives on Hulu.
Oh, interesting.
And I expect that to be a good one. So,
I was going to ask if there's any, that's my blind spot. So if there's anything out there you want to shout out, feel free to shout it out here on the podcast. By the way, if you're tuning back in, recently I've been talking about the Alien franchise. I thought a very entertaining Alien film but last week, Sona, I reviewed Beetlejuice and talked about Tim Burton's extremely long. That episode ended up being longer than I expected because I'm like, man, he's got a lot of movies, but a very long retrospective of Tim Burton's career. And I wanted to ask you, Beetlejuice, the first one, what's your relationship with that? Did you grow up watching that? Is that one of your films or something you never saw, or what's your experience?
I think I didn't see it when it came out. I saw it on TV much later. And it's not one of those movies that I've watched again and again. So I've seen it maybe 1.5 times. And the thing that resonates or sticks with me the most about it is the shake, 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 senora.
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly.
Which is just super fun, right? I think, is that at the very end of the movie? I feel like it's at the end.
There's two dance sequences. There's the Day-O one, and then there's the shake, 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 which is at the very end. You're right. Yeah.
And I remember both of those. So that was the biggest impression it left on me. But I do remember enjoying the movie and thinking it was good. And I am interested in seeing the sequel. And you just reminded me that over my break, I did watch something that was interesting, and it had Michael Keaton in it.
Oh,
and it's a movie. And now I'm Googling the name because I can't remember. No, he is a contract killer or mob guy that has dementia. This is starting to sound very bizarre, but Knox Goes Away.
Knox Goes Away. Yeah.
From 2023.
It's on HBO, I think, correct?
I'm not sure. I walked into the room while my husband was watching it. Have you seen it?
I have not, but he actually directed that film. It's only the second film he's directed. So I am very curious to check it out. Did you like it?
I did like it. It was really an interesting plot, and maybe a little bit, there's a mystery that's ongoing throughout, and maybe a little bit too neatly and conveniently tied up, but I really did enjoy it. Sorry, this is a complete tangent from what you asked, but you just reminded me.
No, I'm glad you brought it up, actually. I have not seen that, and I do want to catch up on it. And it is available on HBO. I'm just looking at it here on my app. It is available to watch on HBO, which is part of the reason I was curious to see it, and also curious to see it. Obviously, he's had quite a renaissance in the past 10 years, really came back in a huge way with multiple Academy Award nominations and being in huge films and resurrecting these characters. Beetlejuice, of course, he resurrected Batman in the Flash movie last year or 2 years ago, whenever that came out. So a huge comeback for him after disappearing for at least 10 years, practically. But this is, as I mentioned, it is a film he actually directed himself. So I am very curious to see it for that reason as well. And the reviews are pretty positive. So anybody who's curious about that.
As I'm looking at it, it's only 65% on Rotten Tomatoes, which I think is not great. But I will say I really enjoyed it. And I'm not a Michael Keaton super fan, but I do like him and his work, generally speaking. I think he's very talented. So I did like this. I
like him, and he is very funny. I rewatched Beetlejuice for that retrospective, and he is so funny, and he's barely in the film. And in the sequel, once again, he's in relatively less film, more of it than the first film, but still relatively little of the film. It has a lot of plot, the new film. I don't know why they put so much plot in there. Like, you literally could say, like, I could take any one of these three main plots and make a movie out of it, but they put them all in the same film. So it's a little too much, but it's just basically a bunch of gags, and they are very funny. And he is great. He comes back, and he is like exactly like he was before. Is very funny, the Beetlejuice character in that.
I actually think he's very funny in real life as well, because I kind of remember years and years ago. I must have been in college or maybe law school, watching an interview between him and Letterman
Yeah.
when the Letterman show was still out. And I just remember being reduced to tears. It was so funny that I was actually crying watching this interview.
An interesting point about that, by the way, is that they started together. They wrote together on some show. And then what happened was that Letterman got the TV show and he was just starting to get like bit roles, but he would bring him on even before he was famous. And then they like rose up together. I think it was like 81, 82 when Letterman starts doing his show. And then I think it's 1982 when he makes Night Shift, which turns to be Ron Howard's second film directing, I think, is like what really put Ron Howard as a director on the map. And that was a hit. And then he made Mr. Mom. And then that was a hit. And then before you know it, a few years after that, he's Batman and he's like a huge star and he's on Letterman's show. Right. So it's like, but they were like buddies before he was even famous. Right. So it's an interesting parallel that you bring up there.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That makes more sense. It's like two old friends talking together can be very entertaining to watch, at least for me.
And it's very funny when you think about Beetlejuice coming out and becoming a hit. And then, of course, Batman right after that, even bigger. And then he comes on the show. And, of course, Letterman's become a huge star at that point, very recognizable. And, of course, he's in the biggest movie in the country. And they started off like writing jokes for other same exact time. So it's a very interesting parallel between the two. Before we get into The Perfect Couple, I do not get any money from Apple TV, by the way. And you may wonder, why am I always talking about Apple TV shows? To be honest, the reason I cover so many of them here, and honestly, they're usually not very popular, just so you know. But the reason I talk about them so frequently here on the podcast is especially with the writer's strike. There's been like a real dearth of product, although now the fall seems now to look like we have a regular fall with some pretty prestigious shows coming out. But for almost a year now, since the writer's strike of last year, there has been relatively few really name brand giant spectacles. We saw even House of the Dragon, which was maybe the biggest show of the summer, which didn't get a finale. Like they basically never shot a finale because of the writer's strike. So the ending was very disappointing to many fans. You're like, wait for next season to get to see this battle. End of show. So even that was disappointing due to this. Anyway, Apple TV, because they just have so much content and they're really making a bid for interest here, just keeps churning out shows. They're not always great, but they keep churning out. And I was working on an episode of saying, is this the moment when you want to activate your Apple TV Plus subscription? By the way, we have new Apple phones that just announced. So if you do get an Apple phone and you get that free subscription, this might be the moment, if not now, then very soon. Because Sona, check this out. Look at this lineup they have right now. First of all, I had recommended to you, and maybe this is how we can frame some of these things you may or may have not watched. I had recommended that you might want to see this Doug Liman thriller, which premiered in August, called The Instigators. And this was a mini regrouping of some of the folks from the Ocean's films. We have Matt Damon and Casey Affleck. Did you happen to watch this?
No, I forgot all about that recommendation and I didn't, but it still sounds good.
It is mildly entertaining, totally fine for TV. I've heard some people really rave about this film and say, oh man, it should have been in movie theaters. There are a couple of really fun car chases in it, I will say, but this is totally the type of thing that I would watch on TV. I don't think I would have paid to see this in theaters, but it is just the beginning of a framing of, hey, here's something that if you are disappointed, can't find stuff to watch on TV, here's something you can watch on Apple TV. This film from Doug Liman, which has some of that energy, some of that Ocean's energy, a crime gone wrong, and then these two kind of bumbling idiots very entertainingly working their way out of this situation. But also, Sona, here's something that I do know you watched, premiering also last month, was Bad Monkey, with honestly Vince Vaughn at his most appealing, in my opinion. And have you kept up with this show?
Again, so disclaimer, I have been super swamped at work. And so I have very little free time to think about anything, especially with school starting at the same time that I'm super swamped with work and travel soccer starting. But this is nobody else's problem but my own. But I completely forgot about Bad Monkey as well. And I remember I texted you the day I watched it. I said, I wish there were no more episodes available. So that is something that I am definitely going to go back to, perhaps even this weekend.
I'll tell you, honestly, I very much enjoy this show, and it is so lightweight, very much like The Instigators to some extent, that as I've watched it, I'm 2 or 3 episodes behind at this point. I think I might have been fallen 3 episodes behind. There was a big reveal in the last episode I saw, which I believe was episode 4. Anyway, all this is to say that I was worried, as entertained as I was in those first 2 episodes when we discussed it off mic, that this wouldn't really be able to hold that up. 10 episodes for this type of show, would it hold up? I have found it to be continuously entertaining, extremely lightweight. I do not think that there's anything urgent here. There was a clever twist about the midpoint of the season. So if you like Vince Vaughn, if you like that type of energy, he is being the entertaining version. Yeah.
It's such a great vehicle for him. This is what we talked about briefly when we both had watched the first 3 episodes. It's the perfect Vince Vaughn vehicle that allows him to display his charisma and his sense of humor and the whole Vince Vaughn manner that he has. So I thought he was very enjoyable to watch in this. I thought the plot was good. I liked some of the other actors. So I think it has a lot going for it. I actually thought just now when you said, like, I'm here to tell you, I thought you were going to say, don't bother. It'll take a terrible turn. So I'm excited that it seems worthwhile.
I'm not fully caught up, so maybe it does go badly, but it is. But I would say it is very entertaining, and I don't expect at this late in the game that it won't still keep giving those same vibes. They're not going to get it wrong at this late in the show, but it's not the type of show where the mystery, I am curious about the mystery, but it's not the reason you're tuning in, right? You're tuning in for the vibes, and they're very funny, very entertaining. And like I said, it's a perfect vehicle for Vince Vaughn's charisma. Also back in August, only 2 episodes into season 2, but I know this one's on your radar, Sona. I don't know if you ever caught up on it at all, but Pachinko is back for season 2. And I have not even seen any of season 2 yet because I'm still finishing off season 1. But this is such a rich and impressive family drama. You don't have to know the history of Japan and South Korea, but if you are curious about that, a more contemporary story, because you watch Shogun, for example, and even features some cast members from that Shogun show. So if you are still curious about the cultural milieu, but it's not just about that, it's about just this beautiful representation by jumping back and forward in these very different time frames through one family history. How, for example, this grandmother, who was central to this sprawling storyline, had an affair when she was much younger and has an illegitimate child, not aware to the family, but then we get to see this counterpoint of this grandchild and this unknown grandfather figure and how similar they are. So it's about how your family history impacts your daily decisions in ways you don't even know, but of course how those family bonds are actually what our histories are made out of. It's about the history of these countries through the point of view of these families. And it is such a rich text. And it's not something you want to binge. It's something you want to digest slowly. So this is an incredible, beautiful, sprawling, expensive show that probably very few people are watching. And give it a shot. You will be mesmerized by just how beautiful it is. And like I said, that just started season 2, so you can catch up before this one wraps up. It's got another 6 or 7 weeks probably before it finishes up. And that's Pachinko, and very highly recommended, and not a binge, something that you want to probably process slowly.
So question about Pachinko, which I probably have been avoiding because I do think it will be very heavy, and I'm just not sure I'm in a mental space for that and to appreciate that right now. But similar to the conversation we've had in connection with other TV shows based on books, are they still within the text of the book, or have they gone beyond where the book goes in the second season?
I did not read the book, but I am pretty sure that they are still on book.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So, and I think that they can keep doing this because they start in the 1980s during the boom years for Korea, really starting to boom in that 80s. I don't know if they're ever going to jump to contemporary times. I do not believe the book makes it that far. So we have this grandson in 1980s South Korea, and simultaneously we jump in parallel to his grandmother's story, which is 100 years earlier, practically almost 100 years earlier, maybe 60 or 70. I might be exaggerating. So the beginning of the century, where Korea's under Japanese control, and then these interesting parallels of how capitalism in some ways freed these people who were like lower class and then they became rich, but then how also it washed away their cultural differences. So there's a lot of themes going on here that are really well represented, not didactically at all. It's just when you just counterpoint how these people change from generation to generation, really fascinating and beautifully done. But to that point, the stories are running in parallel. So I think that the book has very complex storylines that aren't even in the shows so far. So they can easily introduce those because you're filling in those gaps between these multiple threads. So I think that, but I'm pretty sure this is all still on book. Unlike Shogun, which was incredible, but now they've renewed it for a second season, but the whole book was adapted. So they're completely off book for season 2, whatever that happens to be. But as I mentioned, that's really something you want to process more slowly. You don't want to binge, but what is definitely a binge, as a matter of fact, I would recommend you watch this show as a binge, and back for its fourth season, and they've already renewed it for a 5th season, is Slow Horses, which is actually finally starting to cross over and become a pretty big hit and just got an Emmy nomination for Best Series. But this is a espionage thriller set in England, and it's Slow Horses, which is supposed to be Slough House. It's what they call them, Slow Horses. But Slough House is when you are a spy and you screw up really badly, you end up where all the rejects are. And it's the story of the rejects. And this is a thriller, like edge of your seat thriller, and simultaneously like a workplace drama. And it's very funny because the people who are doing this investigation and saving the country from terrorism or whatever are the biggest morons in the world. So it's a very entertaining show, and I highly recommend it. And as a matter of fact, I'm watching it week to week right now, and it's frustrating because it ends on a cliffhanger, and I desperately want the next episode. So my point is, wait for season 4 to end, but you have 3 previous seasons to binge through if you want to, while you wait for this most recent season to end. And it is so far very entertaining. I think they're 3 episodes into the current season. So,
and that's an Apple TV one as well?
That's Apple TV still, yeah. This is all Apple TV content, by the way.
Yeah, I have been meaning to watch that, actually. I've heard good things about it.
Yeah, and it's very entertaining. I think people watch it being like, oh, this is like dense John le Carré stuff. And it definitely is. It's in that world. You can't trust anybody. The government is full of corruption. Everyone's a bureaucrat and is only looking out for themselves. So it definitely has that spycraft to it, but it's from the point of view of like the losers. So it becomes a very entertaining way to perceive this. And like I said, it's very significantly workplace comedy, and it's really good television in the fact that from season to season, your relationship to this character becomes the central character in season 3. It's a very interesting ensemble, and they keep bringing back these really talented actors to do this show 4 seasons in, and I'm sure it will continue as long as it's successful. But there's even more, Sona, even more reasons to start your subscription to Apple TV Plus. The movie Wolves is coming out. This is from John Watts, who directed the most recent Spider-Man cycle of films, but stars, speaking of Ocean 11, George Clooney and Brad Pitt as 2 corporate fixers that basically end up butting heads and maybe buddying up by the end of this. But it's a comedy thriller, has some action elements as well. This just played at the Toronto Film Festival and got pretty good reviews, and that's coming out later this month. So that's as star-studded a film as you can see for the fall season. And hey, it's available on Apple TV. So it's something else to look forward to in the very near future. And then, Sona, I pitched this one to you as something we might be covering week to week. Also premiering at one of the festivals, the Venice Film Festival, was the new Alfonso Cuarón adaptation of the book Disclaimer, which stars Kate Blanchett and much of the stars. Kevin Kline's in this film as well, in this series as well. Sacha Baron Cohen, Leslie Manville. So just a star-studded cast, and from an Academy Award-winning director. So, and has played, like I said, played at the Venice Film Festival and played as a film, basically a very long film, like 6-hour film, and got very positive reviews. And this is also a thriller with family elements to it. So definitely something I'm looking forward to. And so yet something else that everybody can watch, especially if we decide to watch it here on the podcast from week to week. And Sona, also in October, Shrinking is back, one of our favorite comedies from last year. So that's something we can look forward to. There's another thriller coming in the same month with a very unexpected cast. This is a psychological thriller that stars Billy Crystal, but it's not a comedy. This is about a psychiatrist who lost his son, I think, earlier in his life, and now starts to counsel a young man who may have been might have been involved in that disappearance originally. So this is something else that has a very interesting cast and could be interesting as well. Also coming out in October. And Sona, a show that you didn't like as much as I did, Bad Sisters, is coming back for season 2.
I mean, I definitely was in the minority. People love that show. It just, for some reason, for me, it held my interest, but I didn't find it as great as most people do.
Yeah, I very much liked that show. And another show that I covered here on the podcast, Silo, a science fiction series, which I know you did not watch, which I was pretty disappointed, honestly. Although people love that show, I was disappointed with season 1, but it does end exactly when I think the story becomes really interesting. So I think the season 2 could be very interesting. Another book adaptation, by the way. So many of these, by the way, are book adaptations, a pattern in all of these shows pretty much. And then to cap things off, in November, we have the movie Blitz. This is from Steve McQueen. It's about the London Blitz. It's almost certainly going to be a player for the Academy Awards. And of course, last and definitely not least, is that this all leads up to January when Severance comes back for season 2.
Finally.
Finally, indeed. The long-awaited return of Severance, which, by the way, is, as we touched on briefly in an earlier episode, is a really big deal for Apple. Apple desperately needs this show to be a hit. They don't have too many legitimate hits. And this is a very expensive season of TV, apparently, and they need this thing to hit. So if you're just curious about that and you haven't watched it, you can catch up on season 1 or rewatch season 1 and then anticipate season 2. So that is a lot of good content in the next few months. So like I said, if not now to activate that Apple TV Plus subscription, then very soon, because there's a lot of stuff to watch before you wait for Severance. And I'm sure that is going to be a big activation point for a lot of Apple TV Plus subscriptions at that point. All right. So that ate up some of our episode time. Now, I don't know who did this to who, Sona. Or I should say,
is responsible for the fact that we both watched 6 episodes of this show.
Yes, exactly. But I think it's my own. I don't know if you blamed yourself for this at all. If you would each, it's not that bad, by the way.
I don't think it's blameworthy. So why would
right. I'm just teasing about that part of it. But I'm pretty sure I did mention it. I know you brought it up to me very recently to see if we wanted to record about this. But I had suggested this to you about a month ago, going like, oh, this is something that's coming out that you might be interested in. So either way, we were both on the same page at different points, perhaps.
And this is totally the type of thing that I would have watched independent of any conversation with you, for whatever that says about me.
That's part of the reason I brought it up, right? Yeah. Like, in general, it seems to be on this podcast, if we have, you don't even like Nicole Kidman, but if she's in a show, you're watching it. That's how it is. So you can complain about her afterwards, but that's the pattern of the show. So that's just,
it's one of the recurring themes.
It is pretty funny that every single time we watch 9 Perfect Strangers or whatever it happens to be, you're like, I don't know why I watch this show. I don't like her. And it's just like, but you watched all her shows, all of them.
What a marketing success.
Exactly. You just hate watch her in everything she puts out. So that's how she got rich. And yeah, this is based on a book. This is not Apple TV Plus, just to be clear, it's Netflix because we're off topic now. Right. But it is a book adaptation by this author who apparently is extremely successful. I don't know anything about her at all, but I guess she writes a lot of these beach reads. I believe it was mostly romances. This was her first mystery or murder mystery style book, and apparently was an enormous success and really was probably her first true blockbuster. And her name is, do you remember the author's name? It's like Erin Hildebrand.
Oh, right. Yes. It's Ellen Hildebrand, I think.
Ellen, you're right. Yes. Ellen Hildebrand.
She is a very popular author. I have not personally ever read anything by her, but she is very popular.
And has a very attractive cast. Nicole Kidman, Liev Schreiber, Eve Hewson. Speaking of Bad Sisters, this is Bono's daughter, who was also in Bad Sisters, the youngest sister in that series. Megan Fahey from White Lotus, the second season of White Lotus, which we covered here on the podcast, obviously. Jack Rayner, who was in another show we covered here, the Peripheral, which is not coming back for another season, but also someone who's been in the periphery of many shows and movies recently. So an attractive cast, an attractive setting. We have a wedding in where this is Northampton. Is this Northampton? Wait, or did I get that wrong?
This is Nantucket, I believe.
Oh, Nantucket, of course. Yes.
But it does have like a similar Hamptons feeling,
Right.
I think. That whole kind of northeast coast bitchy thing. Bitchy? Why did I say bitchy? Northeast coast.
Freudian slip.
Beachy. I meant beachy.
And so it's this wedding and brings all these different people together. And we find out, as you'd expect in these type of things, there's backstory.
There's a murder. As you
gets
would
dragged
expect.
there's a death. We don't know it's a murder. There's a question for a long period of time as to whether it was accidental or intentional. So, and of course, everyone's secrets get dragged out into the light. Let's start with no spoilers here, because I want to talk about the last episode, which if you commit to this, you really have to hang in there for the last episode, which is in a tone that I honestly think the rest of the show should have been more like that, to be honest.
Yeah.
And they save so much of those twists for the end. So all I have to say is if you quit halfway through, you could honestly just watch the finale if you want to, but you might as well just suck it up and make it to the end, because it is a very entertaining ending. If you watch the first episode and you're hoping that it gets deeper in some way, I'd say you can probably opt out. I would not have chosen to watch this, but since I went halfway through, I'm glad I made it to the end, because it has a pretty, it's not even entertaining, like written or well done. I just think it's bonkers and entertaining in that way. So do we want to say anything else spoiler free before we
want to start at the end and not discuss spoilers? Those two things
I don't want to talk. I don't want to talk about the ending yet. I'm just pitching it that if you are bored 2 episodes in, for example, you do get a bonkers ending. I'm just making that as a sales pitch. But is there anything you want to say about the show before we do get into spoilers?
I agree the ending is bananas. I think I feel a little bit like a broken record, because I think I have made this comment about several shows that we've watched, that like it doesn't seem to land on a consistent tone. Mm-hmm. And it's confusing for me because I don't know where my mind should be. Is this more dramatic? Is it more comedic? Is it more of a thriller? And I feel like the complaint that I consistently have about a lot of things, whether it says something about me or something about what they're making, is this failure to decide on a consistent tone and commit to it. And I don't feel like it's to the benefit of anyone to do that. And I think here, probably what would have made the most sense is to commit to being a little campy, a little bananas, a little bit funny, right? Not necessarily comedy funny, a lot of dry humor or dark humor. I think that would have been, I wouldn't say this was unsuccessful. I watched the whole thing. I liked it. But I think that would have made it even more enjoyable, because I think this started with a much different tone than it ended with.
We have to talk about that too. The first episode is really crazy because you have, it really feels like they shot the first episode and then it got picked up to series, and then they rewrote it or completed writing it and made different decisions. Because like you mentioned, you have all the staff primarily being, you have everybody being questioned at the first episode after the body turns up, but you have all of the staff being very catty and making really obnoxious comments about everybody else in the show that kind of introduces the flashbacks to the characters. And like you said, that
which, by the way, reminded me a lot of Big Little Lies, another Nicole Kidman vehicle, right?
Yep, very much so. I agree.
So I don't know if the book starts with that, but it's very similar to the way Big Little Lies is set up.
Yeah. And then there's some very odd decisions from the point of view of just the way the characters are presented in that first episode. The most glaring one for me is that Nicole Kidman, I just drew my attention to it because right away I'm like, is she going to do an accent? Is she going to sound American? And she very much is talking in her normal accent in the first episode. And then maybe in episode 2 or 3, all of a sudden she's in this very haughty, because now she's suddenly playing this very domineering mother. And it's almost like, to your point of like tone, it's like they chose for her to take a different take on the character. And I'm like, that's odd that they made that decision after episode 1, but maybe, like I said, maybe the production schedule was that way. But even like even the Liev Schreiber character, he seems pretty grounded and I know we're supposed to see him as a more failed person as the show progresses, but he is like literally continuously smoking a joint in the whole remainder of the show. And it's like, it's not even like you go in, once again, a complaint, like to follow up on your tone complaint. It's not like they start to reveal these characters as these messes. It's like you go from episode 1 where they're presenting this version of themselves, and then immediately everybody's a complete mess. Starting at episode 2.
Yeah, my husband didn't even watch this with me, but just from walking in and out of the room while I was watching it, he commented on how Liev Schreiber's character is smoking every single time he sees him.
Every scene, he's smoking a joint. It's constantly. Yeah. And of course, that's not even to talk about the fact that when this is a very stressful weekend, not only because they're having this wedding, but in the series itself. And by the way, the thing that I was most intrigued by in watching this show was, as I was watching it, I was also reading my Wikipedia at the same time to keep my mind occupied watching this show, which doesn't have that much, too many meat on the bones, too much meat on the bone. I was looking at about this author and how successful she was, and so finding out, but also finding out that, for example, she lives in this region of the country. She went through a divorce at around this time that this book was written. She had cancer and survived cancer and then got a divorce after that. So reading these biographical details. So then I couldn't help but read that and then watch this show and be like, is she being autobiographical in this book? Because if so, her husband's a real jerk.
What a life. Yeah.
Yeah. And very tough, especially some of the revelations that come later in the show, in the film, in the series, which I don't even know why they're there, to be honest. We got to get to the end at some point. But
okay, so before we get to the end,
yes,
we need to discuss the dance sequence.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say.
Brings me back to this tone issue, okay?
Yes.
Because by the end, the dance sequence kind of makes sense, but in the beginning, it's like you're watching a train wreck. What is happening with this like happy? I wondered if maybe it was a Bollywood reference once it developed that Shooter was Indian.
That's right.
Which I did feel was a development rather than something that was clear from the start.
Plus, it's called Shooter, so it makes you be not that anyone gets shot in the show, but
yeah, I enjoyed watching it. Honestly, I had the option to skip the dance sequence, and I usually didn't. I usually just sat there and watched it again. So again, excellent marketing. I still watched it, but it was very discordant with the first few episodes of the show to have this like happy type of dance sequence. Although I guess fair to say Bollywood movies are often serious and do have dance sequences, but it just didn't connect. Like it just seemed like such a strange choice.
This whole project is very strange in the fact that that's part of it, is that tone is so strange. And when I saw it first of all, I did also watch it every time, even though it was more head scratching than anything.
Fascinating. You focus on a different character every time you watch.
Exactly. I did the same thing. And this is all intentional, by the way. Netflix, oftentimes, like when we're watching Ripley, when we were discussing that show, you skip past the intro each time because Netflix instant plays. But of course, in the episodes, they don't put the dance sequence at the front. They put it a few minutes in because they know we're going to be watching those dance sequences. What an interesting
point.
And most important of all is that when I was watching this, I was like, they're trying to make something happen here, and I don't think it's going to work. But I was wrong. This show has been very popular, and it's been huge on TikTok because of the dance sequence. So I'm like, these people are putting this on TikTok and imitating the dance. And of course, if just a fraction of those people don't just watch the dance sequence, they watch the show all the way through. That's why it's the #1 show in the country right now.
Amazing.
And so it's all very strangely constructed and very cynical almost in its marketing attempt, but it worked, right? And like you said, it is in a way a better show, may not have been as compelling a watch. So we're in this era of what's popular is not necessarily good. Like I can't get people to watch Pachinko, but everybody's watching this. That's an unfair analogy, obviously, because you can watch this show. I watch this show with half my, literally on another device or in the background while I was making dinner, and I could miss whole minutes of the show and it's fine. And this is very much a casual watch. So this is a very different experience than Pachinko, where you have to sit down and really pay attention. And you want to, right? You really want to savor every moment of it. But this is a completely opposite watch in so many ways.
Okay, I agree with you, but I did try and do a little of that here and there. And let me just issue a warning that the last episode is not the place to do that, because
absolutely
I did
not.
have to rewind it.
Yes.
In order to figure out what on earth had happened. And I only looked away for about 2 minutes.
But to just follow up directly with that, I completely agree. That last episode, I think I rewound a couple of times, and I was paying attention because everything, like all the revelations come. It's just at the end, which once again, I don't understand. This is not a show that's moving at the speed of light. This is a show where maybe one important thing happens each episode. For them to like cram in so much craziness at the end is hilarious. And who wrote these scripts? I don't want to just call people out, because I try not to disparage people when they say this film didn't work for me. I used to be that way. These people are idiots. I don't know what they're doing, because it's very hard to get all these things together.
Sure.
But on the page, if I was reading these scripts, I'm like, why are we putting all these revelations in the end? Like, can't we put some of this earlier on so we can discuss it openly before we get to the end? It just doesn't seem like,
or even just some little hints so that you could have the light bulb moment of like, oh, that's why they said that.
Now it makes sense.
That's why I saw that. Yeah.
It's so funny. Like all the possible suspect motivations are almost all at the end. Who do they potentially tease as a suspect over the course of the show? We have Shooter, who is this Indian guy who presents himself as maybe being more middle class, but then turns out to be very wealthy.
Which apparently was like a huge sin to the main character. I really didn't think offensive. It was as awful as she made it out to be. Yes. It's not like he literally said, I'm poor, I have no money. I understand there was a misunderstanding he could have corrected, but she acted like he had killed her dog.
Honestly, Sona, does anyone behave the way you would expect in most circumstances in this show? The behavior is pretty crazy. Just to speak, let's go back to Liev Schreiber, where I started saying this, but it's not only the wedding that's occurring here over the course of this weekend. She's a very famous author, and she's also having like a big photo shoot for Vanity Fair or some big magazine.
Of course, you would schedule these.
It's all scheduled at the same time, of course. Perfect timing, right? And doesn't call that off, by the way. Yes, we had the death, so we had to call off the wedding, but let's still do the photo shoot. Why would we change our plans? So none of that. And they actually do address this, that there was a miscommunication because it all happened so quickly, etc.
And by the way, people are carrying around like a 5-tier wedding cake as if it weighs a pound. Like the way they are just all navigating around the house carrying this 5-tier wedding cake. I'm not sure if it had 5 tiers. Very tall, and I assume very heavy, very dense.
Yeah. And then it's, yes, exactly. And then so all of this, a pregnant woman, no less, right? So a very pregnant woman. And to your point, that would work in a much more slapstick version of this, but it rarely goes slapstick. Maybe for one scene, but then goes very deathly serious. And you mentioned this to me when you were watching it as well. Like, I can't pick a lane in what I'm supposed to feel. We're supposed to basically laugh at this character who ends up dead being almost like as a punchline, like, oh, we're not supposed to take her too seriously, and let's just have fun and have a dance sequence because her death's not that important. And then we'll come out of the dance sequence and it's like, I can't believe she's dead. She was such an important person to my life. Like, I've lost a sister or something. And the fact that we're supposed to go from like, oh, this is just a fun soap opera, and then jump into like serious questions about her marriage choices and her friends. It's just all over the place.
And what about the way in literally the 48 hours after her best friend's death, people keep asking her if she's okay?
Yeah.
Why would you do that? She obviously is not okay. Give her some space. Why are they acting like she should have snapped out of it by now? Like, oh, you seem a little down. Everything all.
But she seems that way too, right? Like, she's like by poolside or whatever, hanging out, which I don't know if I would just be hanging out poolside 48 hours after my best friend died. But she seems to be like, I'm just trying to read my book here. And I'm just like, not for nothing, but I mean, I just feel like nobody's doing anything that a person would do in that circumstance. Like, it really feels crazy, right? That everybody's taking this death very lightly, even though some of these people have huge potential catastrophic secrets about to come out. When you know the secrets that are going to come out later in the show, it's insane that they are behaving the way they are. And then, yeah, same thing. Even the people who are honestly affected by this, they're supposed to be okay with it. Like, or just like, get over it. Can you smile for the picture, please?
Mhm.
Very bizarre behavior across the board. Okay, so let's start spoiling this thing. So the story, the beginning, I guess the framing device of this whole thing is this wedding. We have Eve Hewson, who is a zoologist. Is that correct?
Yes.
Who is marrying the second youngest member of this family. They have a very strong mother and father who are considered the perfect couple. That's her reputation of this very famous author, apparently. And pretty early on, she's there with her best friend and her maid of honor, Merritt, played by Megan Fahey. And there's this really weird scene where I don't understand. Correct me. I don't understand what's going on here sometimes. But she basically is saying, like, I love my fiance, but I should be in love with him, where thinking that I can't be with him would make me want to murder somebody. And that when I'm not having sex with him, all I'm thinking about is the next time I'm going to have sex with him. And I'm like, is this a 12-year-old's perspective on what marriage is like? Has she been in a relationship before? Because not for nothing, but that level of passion burns out after about a month or two.
I think maybe they were trying to plant the seeds of love making
maybe
people murder.
Killed somebody. Yes, exactly. Yes. It's just a very strange conversation to be having, especially so early in the show when we're just starting to get to know her.
Especially 2 days before the wedding.
Yes. And the questions you should have had. If you expect that you're going to have a real tough time finding somebody, by the way.
Yeah.
I think I still love him, but I don't want to murder someone for him anymore. I don't think it's going to work out. And what else do we see here pretty early on? We see that Thomas, played by Jack Rayner, he is a real jerk. He has an extremely pregnant wife, played by Dakota Fanning, right? Playing his wife, Abby.
Is it Dakota or is it Elle?
I prefer Elle. She's my preferred Fanning. This is Dakota. Okay. Yep. And he's sleeping around with Isabella Johnny, playing Isabel. I guess she couldn't learn a character name, so they just called her Isabel. Who also has a thing for the dad. Apparently everybody has a thing for the dad.
She previously had a thing with the dad. It comes out later. Yeah.
I'll try to see if there's anybody else I want to loop into this whole conversation. And and a couple of other characters here. The youngest son, who is potentially has some weird incel energy going on, because he's very sensitive about girls, especially. He's going through a breakup, and then Merritt flirts with him at some point, and you're like, he's got blood on his hands. So there's a lot of teasing that maybe he's just this out of control teenager. There's also very early on that the sheriff in town, that his daughter has blood on her dress, like in the very first episode. And it's so funny because she's like, maybe it was her. And I'm like, I don't even know these people. How would it be her? How could she possibly be connected to this murder? And by the end of the episode 1, of course, or even before then, I think, actually, we only discover that it's Merritt. That's what happens. The murder investigation is being investigated from the very beginning of episode 1. Once again, a very weird way to structure this script-wise. But we don't find out who is dead until the very end, is when we find out that the maid of honor, Merritt, is dead. And of course, there's all this cattiness. We see that there's this woman who works this is a very funny caricature of the working class, where I don't know if this character exists, but she secretly not only has a thing for the husband, but is annoyed when people even try to clean up after themselves, because that's my job.
I wish I had someone like that in my life.
That's usually my mother. That's usually my mother, by the way.
As far as structure, though, it is similar to Big Little Lies, right? Where
very
you have those police interviews, and I think you spend almost all of the season wondering who's dead. Am I remembering right? The first season?
I don't think that we discover who's actually dead until very late in the game, right?
So actually, we got
at least we found that out earlier. Exactly. And one more character to bring up here briefly is, you already mentioned, was Ishan Qatar, who plays Shooter Duvall, who is the best man to this person. Once again, we don't know why he would possibly be somebody who could have a motive, except that he tries to escape from on the ferry off the island, panics at some point, and of course he becomes a prime suspect. But it turns out that what is happening there is that Amelia, who's looking for this kind of instant karmic connection with someone, apparently did have it with him at some point. There's some story about they ran into each other on a train, which leads until them having like a kiss at one point, which is funny for that kiss to happen, which apparently is the first time it happened. Like there's a tease that maybe they have an ongoing affair, but actually that's the first time it happened. And the fiance walks in on them. And then you're like, aha, they make him look a little crazy there. So they're like, maybe he did it. And it's like, did what? It's like the person's already dead. It's a very strange, the kind of mysteries that they're trying to set up across this show.
Yeah. And then also, I can't remember if it came up in the last episode or earlier, but some kind of connection to a drug cartel.
Oh, yes. So, yeah.
That also involves some Middle Eastern country. And then I wasn't sure if it was the same drug cartel or they were just getting confused as far as like which the geography should be. I don't know.
There was something to do with the fact that when they're investigating Shooter's backstory or about his background, that he had $300,000 that he had received from Greer, who is the Nicole Kidman character. And they thought it was for drug money because he was getting this money to this other character called Broderick, who was staying at a hotel, who was calling her in the middle of the night. But then there was also some kind of plausible deniability that it was some part of some kind of crypto investment, which brought the Jack Rayner character into it, because apparently he is always losing his money, blowing it on these bad investments. And maybe that's how he was involved with this. So it could have been some kind of money laundering. There could have been some drug deal. All of this is really not well defined, even as some kind of potential motivation for this, for the murder. But it's all in there as well in this stew. Even though, by the way, of course, the person who is, I completely forgot to bring up the most important point, which is that it turns out we find out that Merritt is actually pregnant and pregnant with Tag, who is the husband, Liev Schreiber's character, with his child. And even that is very funny because she's super flirtatious. She acts like one of those pansexual monkeys, but she's actually a penguin who wants to mate for life. I'm trying to use my zoology terminology here. But so yeah, it's very weird that they, like, once again, that's where they try to like draw in that maybe it's this sexually frustrated teenager who she flirted with and now he got revenge on her or something.
Right.
But actually she is mated to someone for life, and that is his dad. And wait, maybe he drugged her because he didn't want anyone to find out about this pregnancy. So how did you think about all these? Like, were any of those suspects legitimately in your mind as you were watching this, or what was your experience of that?
I think there was even, maybe it's the younger brother's crush because she was jealous of him, right? So I don't know. I feel like once they introduced the pregnancy part, which was not that far into it.
Pretty early, yes. Yeah.
Those other things were a little bit less likely to me. The younger brother maybe seemed a little bit possible just because, I don't know, teenagers, hormones, they can't control themselves.
Right.
It could be that it would be like an accidental thing, but then put together with the barbiturates, like not a strangulation, not like something that would seem a crime of passion, but something more premeditated. That didn't really add up to me for the younger brother.
And honestly, this is where I didn't take the show that seriously. I think if I was vested in one person being guilty versus another, or sympathetic to one character over another, but any kind of satire here of the rich classes, which of course is very common in shows, doesn't really land in any possible way. And I didn't really like any of these characters. I guess you could like Merritt, but she's not around long enough, although we do see her in flashbacks, but she's really just there to be the victim. So yeah, it's funny to see this as a counterpoint to something like The White Lotus, for example. And you see how it is able to give us very rich characters and still have in the background leaving clues, like who could be doing this? Maybe this is the reason that this person ended up dead. Maybe it's this other reason. And they're just sprinkling it in. So it's interesting to see a very in my opinion, are very well done. Even something that I think is pretty trashy, like season 1 of Big Little Lies, but it's still superior to this, I think.
Yes, agree.
Right. But let's talk about Tag a little bit here, right? So Tag, it's pretty funny that we have this whole situation with Tag where there's the perfect couple or whatever else. But can you give me any kind of explanation for his behavior?
As to why he was singing? No, none.
Yes. Not why. Yes. Why was he singing? And why does he go and have like a nervous breakdown in front of that press corps during her event?
Yeah.
Under what circumstance is that? It can't just be smoking marijuana.
Some kind of self-destructive streak. I don't know.
It just doesn't make any sense. Like no one would do that. Once again, like so many things in the show, no one would do that under the circumstances, especially when he has so much to lose, right? Like he knows.
That's the thing. And that's what comes out throughout the course of the series. Yeah.
Yeah. So then we get to the finale. And of course, Tag is very much the prime suspect at that point. And they just keep layering on all of these revelations, one after the other. There's the fallout from the kiss. There's the argument between Shooter and Amelia. Like you said, she gets way overreacts that, wait, you're a billionaire? How dare you? Right?
Yeah. I mean, even though being like, wow, this works out for me.
Yeah. That is the craziest thing for me in this whole entire story, is that she's so offended by him being a billionaire or whatever, instead of, like you said, thinking like this could work out, right? Because this is someone I'm attracted to who's still rich. And the reason I mentioned that specifically is the only reason she is still interested once she sees, for example, multiple times that her husband to be is pressuring her because his mommy yelled at him or whatever. That is so utterly unattractive that she must look at that and go, not about like, oh, I don't know if I'm horny enough for this guy, but just the idea of like, every time mommy says jump for the rest of my life, I have to say how high. I don't know if I want to be in this situation. The only reason she would keep doubling down on it, I think, is because, hey, am I going to pass up this opportunity? Here's another opportunity that looks even better, to be honest.
Right. Yes.
And now she's moralizing about it.
What could be better?
Right. Exactly. So yeah, that is bizarre that she puts up with her fiance's behavior and then somehow is so offended by what not as bad behavior, honestly, from Shooter.
Yeah, and someone who she seems to have way better chemistry with,
right?
From what we're shown and have bonded with, which, like, okay, maybe arguably false pretenses, but honestly, I would love it if my husband told me today that he's secretly been a billionaire this whole time. That would be fine with me.
You'd divorce him immediately. Well, you'd have to negotiate that the severance package first. Though.
Yeah.
But the funniest revelation that comes at the end, before we'll get to the killer, obviously, but the funniest revelation is for absolutely no reason at all, like literally no reason at all from the point of view of the plot. These investigators suddenly have this theory that this is all about money laundering. And there's this guy who's been calling you in the middle of the night. He's a gangster and you are actually laundering money for this guy. And she goes, you want to know what's actually happening? He's my brother. And not only is he my brother and I'm bailing him out because he's always getting bad things, I was a prostitute when I met your father. This scene is one of the craziest things I've ever seen.
Bananas. In front of all the children.
And the funniest thing about it is that the show, could have completely ignored this plot and doesn't, even if it's in the book, unnecessary, but no, they put it in there. And then, of course, and this is multiple revelations like this in the final episode, but this is the most pronounced one, where they make this revelation and she's like, and we will never speak of this again. And everybody just shrugs their shoulders and moves. Like, what? If there's no consequences to this revelation, why is it even in the story? It is so bizarre. This is the most bizarre choice of this whole entire. And it's only like a minute long, by the way.
The choice to me is she seems like she was a fairly high-end escort.
Right.
Why did she choose this guy whose money is all tied up in whatever mechanisms that make it inaccessible to him? So she's got to actually work for a living. Right. Why would she do that?
Maybe she wouldn't have known, and he presented himself as richer than he was. But it is very funny that, like you mentioned, she is basically a self-made woman after because she's like, I married him. He was rich at the time. Turns out he's like a lazy layabout who just wants to smoke pot all day long. So I had to work and I became a multi-millionaire
with an empire.
With an empire. Yeah, exactly. Like she's basically, even think about when the book was written, the Ellen Hildebrandt, the actual person, she was a modestly successful romance writer. She was not the industry that she is now. This is the first time she had a huge bestseller. So this is basically what she's aspiring to become someday. And so she is already that. She is like the 10, 20 million copy seller of these novels, supposedly. So she's built herself up into a brand, like you said. And so why exactly does she need this guy around? Like, what was the purpose of having him around? She could have dumped him a long time ago if he was this problematic. Apparently, he's been cheating on her this whole time through. So I'm like, what was all that about?
Yeah, I don't think it was needed, most importantly.
Right.
But I don't think it clears up much of anything either. So it just one of those things that raises more questions than it answers.
Exactly. That's that detail and when it's executed so late in the game, which possibly, by the way, it could have been interesting to have it somewhere in the middle of the storyline where there's many episodes where very little happens. Something like that could have happened. And the kids could have had this falling out and been like recontextualize their relationship to their mom. And maybe that's why she's so prissy about maintaining this illusion, because of course she's terrified of her past being revealed. So there is psychology that is valuable there that could have been used somewhere in the show, but to introduce it at the end and then it really seems to have no real bearing impact on anyone's actions after that. It's like, why even introduce this in minutes before the show ends? It is so bizarre.
So bizarre.
So bizarre. Thomas, the Jack Rayner character, basically saying, aha, I know what this is all about. She was pregnant. She was going to blackmail the family because their money would be tied up in these trusts and everybody's about to get their trust money because their youngest son's about to turn 18 and that money's about to get released. And now if there's a pregnancy, it throws everything out of whack. So somebody murdered for that reason. And he's the one who comes up with the explanation. He is incorrect about who he's pointing the finger at, but that does turn out to be the motivation. It turns out to be the motivation of his very wife, who is, of course, pregnant and probably annoyed with him cheating on her and dealing with all this bananas family. And she's like, I am not waiting 18 more years for this money. I am going to kill this pregnant lady. So it was indeed the pregnancy, but it wasn't who they thought was going to.
It was Dakota Fanning.
It was Dakota Fanning. Dakota Fanning did it. So that's it. If you're waiting for that, now you know. But that's not the end of the movie, by the way. It ends when Amelia decides to go back to work at her zoo and Nicole Kidman comes and visits her and says,
I think this is a zoo in Europe, actually. I think it's in London.
I may have not been paying attention enough to know.
Understood. Yeah.
But yeah, so she's working at a zoo and Greer goes and visits her and says, I'm going to turn that whole thing into a novel, which I guess is the novel we'd be reading in this case, if we were reading it. And she like invites her out to lunch or something. She's just like, I thought you didn't like me. And she's like, oh, I do like you now that I have admitted that I'm a prostitute.
I don't know what changes have happened in her life, but she's suddenly a completely different person than she was for the rest of the show.
Once she let go of her illusions, I guess she could be herself, and that's going to give her the biggest hit of her career. I don't know.
It was just exhausting her to pretend that she was never an escort. I don't know.
So long story short, 10 out of 10.
Listen, here's the thing, and we discussed this briefly over text. This was not a Labor Day show. This was a Memorial Day show.
Right.
This was the perfect beachy type of thing to have on in the background while you're taking it easy, maybe day drinking, right? Like,
yes.
That's the kind of show it is. It did not have the right vibes for fall back to school. So we might have enjoyed it more in the right context, or at least I might have. But I still binge watched it. I still finished it in a couple of days. It still held my interest for the most part. I found the characters fun. You had made a comment over text that like they're not even going to other settings, which is a good point. This kind of felt like a COVID show of like, we're just going to be in this house and nowhere else so that we don't have to worry. So that was strange, but they still had like a beachy vibe to it. I liked the outfits. I liked the actors. It was fun. At times it was campy. I wish it had been more of a committed to thing. I just think overall, it probably did what it set out to do, whatever you may think of that goal.
At no point did I watch this show thinking it was going to be an extremely deep show, but I'm going to once again draw the analogy to The White Lotus season 2, for example, more than season 1, which really was shot during COVID. So it was really just in the few rooms, but season 2 of The White Lotus. And once again, I don't expect this thing to be as good as that, but you think about how many things that show did. It's obviously much better written and it's interested in all this subtext, but let's strip all that away. It's beautiful to look at. You have a very attractive cast. It's sexy. Like there is actual sex in the show, right?
Yes.
Like there is things that are attractive for it just on the surface. Like if that show in the end had been flatly written and disappointing payoff to the murder mystery, which you may argue that it wasn't that great murder mystery in that particular show anyway, but it didn't even matter to me because all the other things were so rich that even then the show would just be, as a watch, more compelling because, you know, you're out on this island, you're looking at these beautiful scenes, these beautiful people, right? And all these things, right? This was like people in a kitchen carrying a cake around, you know, on the same beach over and over again, by the same pool over and over again, wearing the same clothes over and over again, talking about sex, but never having sex. You know, like, it was like, okay, all right. It was not enough of that.
There was a little bit of sex in there.
A little. It wasn't titillating enough. And it wasn't even like campy enough, like even whether intentionally or not intentionally. Like you mentioned, a little bit of that energy of that kooky last episode. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it makes you appreciate things, even something that is nowhere near as good as season 2 of The White Lotus, which we just watched. Speaking of Apple TV, another reason to watch Apple TV, if you want to get caught up on this, if people have been recommending it to you. Presumed Innocent, which starts off great, turns into a completely trashy show, takes the original storyline and adds a whole bunch of other details. And we hated some of those details and we loved some of those details, but I find that was like episode to episode way more entertaining than this show was.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's what I'm saying. Don't shoot. You don't even have to hit White Lotus season 2, which is going to get like 17 Oscar Emmy nominations. You could just shoot for Presumed Innocent or like, which is like, that's not going to win any Emmys. No Emmys there, but it was maybe Peter Skarsgård, by the way, maybe he gets an Emmy. He was incredible in that show.
As I'm thinking about this, I think it ended up being like a Big Little Lies, Desperate Housewives hybrid. Right. Of like Desperate Housewives was more campy. The same idea of one of the group is dead and who did it. Although if I recall correctly in Desperate Housewives, it was a suicide. I'm not sure.
I never saw it.
So maybe not who did it. Maybe it was always a suicide. They knew that. I think it landed someplace in between those two shows.
Maybe. I can't judge based on Desperate Housewives, but Big Little Lies was like that for me, definitely. But even that, I think, is better. Was better.
It had more nuance in the relationships. Yeah. Yes.
There was more interest in the psychodynamics of those characters. And honestly, like that's where I think that's maybe just where I gravitate to more. Off Mike, I was recommending to you to check out the remake of Speak No Evil, which just came out in movie theaters this weekend or is coming out. That's based on a European film, which has an extremely difficult ending and would never get adapted to an American film. And I was wondering, how are they going to adapt this? And it's more entertaining in a traditional way, which is why I recommended it to you. But the reason I recommended it to you is not even for the thriller elements of it. It is this psychodynamics of putting you into an uncomfortable situation and then dealing with that. And I really like that. I like seeing people in a situation, not always an uncomfortable one, but something that takes them out of their day-to-day, and then how they need to accommodate that, like discover different aspects of themselves. And like I said, even with Big Little Lies, I feel like there was more of an interest in that than we see here, where these people never felt like real people to me in any way. Mm-hmm. And then if that's going to be the case, then you have to lean into that and say, yeah, it's just a TV show. It's just fun,
Right.
which is what the dance sequence seems to indicate. But
Right.
then the show doesn't deliver in that way. So I was pretty
Right.
disappointed in all those ways I just described.
Yeah, I understand that, and I can't argue with it.
It's not like you're going to put in a lot of effort and then be frustrated at the end. This is, like you said, put it on. You're watching it with your spouse or with your girlfriends, and you just kick back and look up and tune in and say, why would he say that? And like laugh about it a little bit. It's entertaining in that way. In other words, it's not that the show is entertaining, but your experience of watching it might be entertaining. And those actually are decoupled in this particular case. As in, like, me talking to you right now is entertaining, more entertaining to me than the show was. So anyway, take that all with a grain of salt. All right. Thank you, Sona, for this conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Me too.
And we'll think about what we watch next. If you do decide to go see Speak No Evil with your husband, maybe we'll discuss it next week. I will spoil on you. I think I mentioned this, maybe I didn't, but I had seen that movie when it premiered on Shudder at the time. There was a lot of buzz about it, the original, that is.
The original,
and as I was watching it with all social anxiety and these kind of cultural expectations and all these questions you ask, which are questions that I know we've like had conversations about. I think it's anxieties that you personally have. And I was like, ooh, I got to recommend this to Sona. And then we got to the end of the movie and I'm like, Sona can never watch this movie.
She'll never be the same.
I did not recommend it to you here on the podcast. And anyway, so now this is, I think, much more palatable to Americans and to you in general. So if you do go see it, I think you'll enjoy it. Although it still makes you squirm a lot, but that's part of the pleasure in a way. So if you do decide to catch it, we can discuss it on the pod, and I can spoil you on the original and tell you just how terrible it could have been for you experience. And then, but then we'll look at what else we can discuss. We can definitely talk about that Alphonse Cuarón series in October, but maybe something else will pop up along the way that we can discuss before then.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Talk to you soon.